Well, it's great to see everybody here this evening. My name is Ryan Goodwin, and it is really good to be here. My family drove up with me today. They spent the whole day in the car, so I have heavy motivation to keep this very engaging and tight. So we're going to get through all the material. I'm looking at Ephesians chapter 4, verses 17 through 24 with you this evening on the subject of the old self and the new self, and just what exactly that means. And hopefully we'll be able to get into a lot of practical application as well. Because, there we go. As Paul explains here in this passage, this is of utmost importance to us. Now I thought, how am I going to start this lesson tonight? You know, preachers have to come in with like a joke or an anecdote or something. And I was given the option of making this an interactive presentation, if we wanted this to be a class or not. I had not prepared for it to be interactive, but I have one interactive thing that I would like you to do, and I've been very excited to do this all day. I would like a show of hands for anybody in this room who is either from or who has lived in Oregon. Right now, I think that is the highest density of Oregonians in the Eastern time zone in one place at this moment. I'm very excited about that. I am from Oregon. I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon. Of course, Phil used to preach out there. The Browns also are from Oregon, and their kids as well were all born out there. So I think all of them were born in Oregon, right? Yeah. So I just thought it was kind of neat, like how often on the outskirts of the Atlanta metro area are you going to find that many Oregonians in a room together? And the fact that we all have known each other for so long. So I just love the background there. I think that's really exciting. It is really good to be here. But preaching and life does take us far. And I'm in Gainesville, Florida right now. I preach for the Glen Springs Church of Christ right now. We've only been there for about a year. So I don't know if we consider ourselves real Floridians just quite yet. Although everywhere I go and for my whole life, I'll always be an Oregon Duck fan. Not a Beaver fan, but an Oregon Duck fan. All right, let's go ahead and get into the material here because we have a lot to cover. It's a very exciting passage. And as I said, hopefully we're going to get into a lot of really practical things here. Stuff that's going to touch our lives in the day-to-day rather than just the big picture 30,000-foot view. So let's start here and we'll read the passage together so that we can be real clear about what our agenda is for tonight. Ephesians chapter 4, beginning in verse 17. This I say, therefore, and affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer just as the Gentiles also walk, in the futility of their mind, being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God, because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. And they, having become callous, have given themselves over to sensuality for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. But you did not learn Christ in this way. If indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, just as truth is in Jesus, that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit, and that you be renewed in the spirit of your mind and put on the new self, which in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth. Now, I don't know how recently you've studied through Ephesians. I don't know if it's real fresh to you or not, or if it's maybe a letter you haven't studied recently. I don't know you or what your familiarity is. Maybe you're a visitor with us tonight, and you never read Ephesians at all. Well, that's okay. It's a very simple message. The Apostle Paul is writing to a group of Christians in the city of Ephesus, a very important, very wealthy city in what we would call modern-day Turkey. But the thing about Ephesus is idolatry was also huge in Ephesus. There was a great big temple to Diana, or Artemis as she's called in the Greek. And, I mean, it was it. It was the whole economy of the town. It was huge. It was a great big tourist trap. People from all over the Roman world came to Ephesus to see this great temple. The temple also served as like the central bank of the city. So most of the wealth was flowing through that temple, whether by tourists or people starting businesses. Their whole lives were wrapped up in Ephesian Artemis. There was a great festival every year that involved, for lack of a more gentle term, orgies and drinking parties and all kinds of personal. Just let your imagination fill the blank in, but don't let your imagination fill it in too much, because it was as bad as you would think that it was. And so here's Paul writing to a group of Christians. These are people who have come out of that life. They've come out of a life where their entire lives were wrapped up in this one big thing in Ephesus. Now, I didn't preach on Ephesians 4 at Glen Springs recently, but I did pull something out of Ephesians back home. And the analogy that I used to explain it is, back in a college town like Gainesville, really the whole economy is wrapped up in the university. I mean, that's it. If it wasn't for the University of Florida, Gainesville would be like a marathon gas station stop on I-75, and that would be about it. And there might be like a Motel 6 and a Budget Inn down there. But if it wasn't for the university, nobody would want to live in Gainesville. You're too far from the beach, right? You're too far from the beach to want to live in Gainesville. And that's how Ephesus was. It was an important cultural center primarily because of the Temple of Artemis. Their whole lives were wrapped up in this. So then it gives you some context here that when Paul is saying your old self and your new self, your old life and your new life, the way that you used to live, the way the Gentiles lived, the life that you came out of, you're going to live a completely different life now. It is defined differently. It acts differently. It looks differently. From the inside out, it is a completely different life. And that must have been an incredible challenge to them. And I sympathize with the challenge that the Ephesians must have had. And so here in this passage, in sharp, dramatic terms, Paul lays out the great change that happens to anybody, them as well as us, when we're transformed in Christ. And right away, one of the obstacles that we face in embracing and experiencing this great change is, ironically, our own baseline sense of morality. Now here's the thing. If you grew up in Ephesus and you were an Ephesian and you grew up debauching yourself every spring during the great big Artemis festival, and that's just what it was. I mean, debauchery of all kinds, drinking and sex and everything that's involved in that, temple prostitutes and idolatry and all of its trappings, and you've come out of that life. To be fair, the change from that to a Christian is very clear. But let's say you didn't grow up in Ephesus. And maybe you didn't grow up in a religious family per se, but you had good parents, and they raised you in a clean environment, and you guys watched a lot of reruns of the Brady Bunch growing up. And like the most salacious thing that ever happened to you is, well, we watched a PG-13 movie one time, and your parents didn't smoke and didn't drink, and you had a good life, and you're a good person. I pay my taxes and obey the speed limit. I'm a nice guy to my neighbors. I'm a good person. I think there's a built-in challenge there, isn't there? That when you already view yourself as I'm a pretty good person already, then the message of the gospel comes in, and I think it sometimes falls on deaf ears. You read a passage like Ephesians 4 and say, the old self, calloused and hard and dark and ignorant, and you go, it's a good thing that wasn't me. That's definitely not me. I imagine that is probably the challenge that we face in our own Western culture, maybe more than what they had to face in a city like Ephesus and its culture. Because when you're raised in the church, and I hate that phrase, by the way, it's one of my big pet peeves. Were you raised in the church? Yeah, I was raised in the church. Do you even know what that means? What the implications are of that statement? But when you're quote-unquote raised in the church and you had a Christian home or a Christian upbringing and a Christian worldview, then when it comes to like baptism, you're like, well, not a whole lot changed for me. I got baptized, and I guess baptism was just like the last kind of like little step I needed to take to where I was finally on easy street on the road to heaven. And so rather than embracing the brilliant dichotomy of a passage like Ephesians 4, I may secretly bristle at the notion that I was ever in a state that Paul describes here. I look at words like ignorant, futile, darkened, excluded, calloused. No, that could never be me. That never was me. Are you so sure? Now, to be fair, this obstacle is not unique in our circumstances. Jesus also faced a lot of that in his own ministry. When he would reach out to, even the people that he called to be his own disciples, who are the apostles. When he called out people in the synagogue who were Pharisees or synagogue leaders. These were people who, again, had a baseline morality that I think would have made it very difficult for them to think in terms of darkened and calloused and ignorant and I'm outside of everything, I'm excluded. Take Nicodemus as a great example. In John chapter 3, when Jesus has this nighttime conversation with Nicodemus, he talks about if you want to be part of the kingdom, you must be born again. And that's very challenging for Nicodemus because he looks at his own self and he says, well, hold on. And I know this isn't recorded in the conversation, but this had to be going through Nicodemus's mind. Not in the kingdom? To be part of the kingdom, I have to be born again. I thought I was in the kingdom. I've got the right ethnicity. I'm Jewish. I had the right upbringing. I'm circumcised. So I've got the physical mark of somebody who should be in the kingdom. I've kept the law. I've kept the Sabbath. I've kept all the food laws. I'm even a teacher of Israel. I'm a rabbi. I'm Nicodemus, for crying out loud. And you're trying to tell me that I'm not in the kingdom. For Nicodemus's entire life, he was operating under the presumption that he was already in. And now Jesus comes along and says, unless you're born again, you're not in the kingdom. The Pharisees, after this whole incident in John chapter 9 with the man who was born blind and Jesus gives him his sight back and they have the whole thing with that, at the end of the chapter some Pharisees come up to Jesus and say, well, we're not blind too, are we? And he said, well, as long as you're still in your sins, yeah, you're blind. I don't think that those Pharisees had ever heard anybody tell them anything like that. John chapter 8 is the same way. In John chapter 8, there's this long argument that Jesus has with a Jewish audience. And he talks about who your father is. And there's a lot of implications there. We don't want to get into that here. But they defend themselves. Well, we know who our father is. Our father is Abraham. And the notion that you've been enslaved, right, about the truth sets you free. You shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. And their response is, what do you mean set free? We've never been enslaved. How can you be set free when you've never been enslaved? Matthew chapter 23, and the Pharisees, the hypocrites, they go and make disciples, but they end up making them more a son of perdition than they were before. You put on a good show, you do all the right things. You have the exterior appearance of someone who is incredibly righteous, like a whitewashed tomb or a cup that's been cleaned on the outside, but the inside is still filthy. You're hypocrites. And so in the end, the great lie of the old self, whether that old self is a debauched Ephesian who just got out of a life of temple prostitution, or the old self is the delusion of self-righteousness and Phariseeism, whatever your old self was, the great lie of the old self is that the old self was always good enough. And what can Jesus possibly offer somebody who's already good enough? The most indulgent, despicable sinner will always be able to point to the fun and the wild oats being sown and the thin veneer of happiness and say, I was good enough and I had enough before Jesus. And the most self-righteous, pharisaical moralist can dismiss conversion altogether because it's unnecessary. I was already good enough without Jesus. So no matter who you are, you can convince yourself that you're good enough without Jesus. Whatever the old self is, it will not go but kicking and screaming its fingernails dug into the drywall of my soul. And now here's the Apostle Paul saying, the old self has to be done away with. Now, easier said than done. Let's look again at the passage and pick out some words here that really stand out. Very striking words. Go back to Ephesians 4 and verse 17 here. So he says again, I say therefore and affirm together with the Lord that you walk no longer as the Gentiles walk in the futility of their mind. Isn't that a great word? Futility. The futility of their mind, like having tires stuck in mud. The futility of their mind. Like trying to push buttons on a microwave that's not plugged in. The futility of... You ever do that with your toaster? You ever put toast in and you click the thing and you go away and do something else and you come back and it's still just a piece of bread in there and you've got to plug the toaster in? That's the futility of their mind. But he says other words here in verse 18, being darkened in their understanding. That's a really rich word, especially when you think in like the broader context, like Genesis through Revelation type broader context. Light and darkness are constantly being contrasted in the Bible. Whether it's in Genesis 1 and the whole earth was dark and formless and void, and so God said, let there be light. You go all the way into John chapter 1 and it describes Jesus as being the light that comes into the world. Right? All throughout Scripture, darkness and light are contrasted because they're polar opposites from each other. And so here we have this great word, darkened in their understanding. Excluded, he says, excluded from the life of God. Well, wait a minute. I've been included in a lot of other things. I was included in school activities and included in sports. I'm included in my nationality. I'm included in my citizenship. The Ephesian temple of Artemis made me feel very included when I went out during the festivals and we were out having orgies in the street. I was absolutely included in all of that. But you were excluded from the one thing that really mattered. The one thing that was really important, you were excluded from that. Let me say something here. You are how you think. Because right along with these words that he says, futility, darkened, and excluded, he also attaches a couple other things. You're futile in what? In your mind. You're darkened in what? Your understanding. You're excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that's in them, because of the hardness of their heart. Notice the relationship here between mind and action, between condition and mind. A dark, futile, ignorant, calloused mind will always find ways of justifying the behavior. Think of it, even in modern terms, we do the same thing. We'll justify vengeance by saying, well, he deserved what he got. Well, if she had only been a better wife, I wouldn't have had to be the husband that I was. Listen, I'm only just taking what's owed to me. I've got to get mine, right? I'm just a product of the system. I can't help it. I am what I am because of how I was raised. And the very state of our minds becomes the inarguable rationale for all of our sins. I get to blame society. I get to blame the system. I get to blame the church. Bad leadership in the church. I get to blame my bad upbringing, religious hypocrisy, corporate brainwashing. But there's an old Latin phrase, cogito ergo sum. You've probably heard that a time or two. I think, therefore I am. As in, the basis of reality, at least personal reality, personal perspective on reality. The basis for knowing that anything can exist begins with, well, at least I know I exist. I think, therefore, at least I know I am. But I think there's also a Latin phrase that is true. Sum quod cogito, which is that I am what I think. I am what I think. My thoughts are my responsibility. And listen, we can go out and do all the right things. I can go out and be really nice to people. But as soon as I get back in my car, I make a racist statement under my breath. I can go out and be really nice to people, but when I get home, I hold nothing but resentment for people. I'm just always gaming the system out there. Sure wish people would get a job so I wouldn't have to go practice on this charity. Am I the charity, or am I what I'm thinking? You are what you think. You are your thoughts. Now, a lot of times the thoughts can be covered up with a thick varnish of actions, but more often than not, the thoughts become the actions. And you are responsible for those same thoughts. And I think that's why the Apostle Paul makes a great statement in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 5. When he talks about the kind of warfare that we're engaged in, he says this is not physical warfare that we're engaged in. He says in verse 5 of 2 Corinthians 10, we are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Because if you are what you think, then you better get your thoughts under control. Because God doesn't just judge the actions, He also judges the thoughts and intentions of our hearts. Beware of the trap, though. While the description of the old self can sound very harsh, even extreme fundamental I think I put a mistake there. I'm glad I ran this as I'm going to preach this on Sunday at Glen Springs, and this is the test run for Sunday. Even if this sounds very, very harsh, it still describes the condition of all of us outside of Christ. There's no comparison. Like maybe you read Ephesians 4 and you go, well, at least I'm not that bad. I mean, I'm not hard-hearted and calloused and I'm not totally ignorant. Well, outside of Christ, we are what we are, and what we are is lost. You notice in Ephesians 4 that Paul doesn't frame it just in terms of like debauchery. It is about our thinking. It is about our heart. It is about how calloused we've become. And in verse 19, having become callous, they've given themselves over to sensuality. It started with this, the heart and the mind. And because the heart and the mind become callous, the behavior inevitably follows. For the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. Every kind. I think we also say things like, well, I would never become that. I mean, I would take my sin this far, but I would never cross this line. Well, Ephesians 4 is saying, listen, once you cross the line, every form of evil is now available to you. Once you've relaxed yourself and become comfortable in one sin, it is not a big leap to become comfortable in the next sin, and the next sin, and the next sin. And because your heart and your mind are lost, your heart and your mind are dark, your heart and your mind are callous, your heart and your mind are excluded, your heart and your mind are in this position as the old self still. Listen, he says every evil deed, every kind of impurity essentially becomes on the table. Nobody wakes up one morning and says, I'm really angry at my brother. And I anticipate by the end of whatever's going to happen, I will have murdered him. Nobody wakes up in the morning thinking like, Phil and I disagreed about something and we're kind of on the outs right now. Probably the end result is I'm going to murder Phil. And I'm a little younger than him, so I'm much more spry. I remember back in the day, I described it to my kids. I said, well, I've known Phil for a long time. You're going to meet him when we go down to Sharpsburg or up to Sharpsburg. He's this great tall guy with red hair and a red beard. What happened to the red beard?
This went away.
Yeah. I used to have a nice dark beard as well. And it's like, every time I shave my beard off and then regrow it, it regrows whiter and whiter and whiter every single time. Now, there's another word here in Ephesians 4 that I'm going to highlight, and it's a little word. It's just 3 letters, okay? Just 3 letters. But it's amazing how some of the smallest words in our language can convey some of the biggest meaning. And it's the word but. You were the old self. You were everything described, calloused and hard-hearted and excluded from Christ. But. And that is the beauty of the gospel. With the gospel, there's a therefore. With the gospel, there's a but you don't have to be this way. With the gospel, there's but because of Jesus, there's always something different. We're opened up from exclusion and darkness and ignorance. Light bathes us. The scenery opens up. The constraints of a life in idolatry and sensuality and greediness and impurity become a wide open vista to us. From darkness to bright day. Now, it's a process. And so let me reread again this second half, the back half of our passage, and then we'll go back and we'll look at some words, right? I like to look at the words because the words are where the meaning is, but let's reread the back half of the passage. But you did not learn Christ in this way, because there's an alternative. There's something different now that you have. If indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, just as truth is in Jesus. I will say, I've got a point about that, so hold on. That in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lust of deceit, and you be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and put on the new self, which in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth. Notice from this passage, there's several incredible words that show that it is a process that we undergo. Our lives are not static. Take a look at words like walk. That the Christian way is called a walk. Conversely, the Gentile way was a walk as well, and that you need to no longer walk in that way, but now walk in a different way. It's a manner of life. It is behavior and all-encompassing. Having become calloused, practicing, learn, which is being corrupted, renewed. Right? These are process words that you see in this passage. So if you're expecting everything to change all at once, you may be setting yourself up for discouragement. That's especially important in personal evangelism, and I'll do a little evangelism plug here. We've got to pick our battles with people when we're studying with them. You know, they're learning, they're growing. We've also got to be very strategic about the battles that we fight. And knowing that there will be a time, if I do my work now, if I lay the groundwork now, if I put a good foundation now, the time will come that I can address that thing later. And I will address it later. But we'll get to that.